My name is Maria Alvarez. I am 22 years old, born on May 1st, 2003, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I have lived in the same city all my life, in a modest house on Calle del Sol, with my parents and my older brother. My family is of Latin American descent. Both of my parents came to the United States before I was born, and they worked hard to build a quiet life for us here. On the outside, we looked like an ordinary family. I studied, worked part-time, and kept mostly to myself. There was nothing unusual about us that anyone could see, but what was happening inside our home and inside me was far from ordinary. After telling you who I am, I wish I could tell you clearly what happened that night. But the truth is I can't. My memory doesn't line up like a neat row of dominoes. It's scattered, broken, like pages ripped from a book and thrown into the wind. The first page I find is noise. My brother's voice, sharp, impatient. My mother's voice rising, trying to soothe but turning brittle. My father stepping in, his tone final, heavy, the kind of tone that always made me shrink inside. I don't remember the words. I remember the heat of them, the rhythm of anger, the way each voice layered over the other until it felt like the walls were shaking. Then I'm moving. I'm walking from one room to another, restless, unable to stand still. My chest is tight, my throat dry, my hands trembling. Every step feels wrong, like the floor beneath me is shifting. I stop in the kitchen. The clock on the microwave says 9:27 p.m., and I stare at those red numbers as if they hold some answer. They don't change though. Time feels stuck, frozen. Next, silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating one. A silence that presses against my ears, louder than shouting. I know things happened in that gap, but my memory refuses to give them to me. It's like a curtain came down, and when it lifted, everything had changed. I look at my hands. They are shaking. I don't recognize them. They feel detached, like they belong to someone else. I study them as though they might confess the truth, but they don't. They tremble, they twitch, pale under the dim light, and all I can do is stare. The air is thick, like breathing through water. My thoughts won't settle. Images flash and disappear. The room seems distorted, the shadows too long, the furniture slightly out of place, though I know it hasn't moved. My body feels unfamiliar, as though I've stepped outside myself and left someone else behind to act in my place. That's what I remember most, the disconnection. The feeling that it wasn't me, that someone else had taken over in those lost minutes. And yet when the silence came back, I was the one standing there. I was the one left to face the weight of what had been done. Even now I lie awake some nights, trying to drag those missing moments back into the light. Sometimes I catch glimpses, a blur of motion, a sound, a flash of something too quick to hold. But the harder I try to remember, the faster it fades. What lingers is not the act itself, but the silence that followed, the kind of silence that changes everything. Sometimes I think memory is less about truth and more about survival. The mind holds on to what it can bear and shuts away what it cannot. That's why my recollections of that night feel less like memories and more like hallucinations. Distorted, incomplete, unwilling to align into something coherent. One fragment that returns to me is the hallway. I see myself standing there, the light from the ceiling bulb flickering. I don't know if it really flickered that night or if my mind has inserted the detail afterward. Either way, I remember staring up at that light, hypnotized by its trembling glow, as if the bulb itself was nervous, shaking along with me. The walls felt narrow, too close together, like they were inching inward. My breath echoed unnaturally loud in that space, and every inhale felt jagged. Another fragment, the front door. I thought about leaving, just running out into the night, barefoot if I had to, disappearing into the streets of Albuquerque. I even remember my hand touching the cold metal of the doorknob, but I didn't open it. Something in me held me there, rooted in the house as if the walls were not only closing in but also gripping me, refusing to let me escape. The thought of leaving should have been liberating, Gihar, yet instead it filled me with dread, as though stepping outside would only make everything worse. There's also the fragment of sound, or rather the absence of it. It's strange because even silence has texture, and this silence was thick, suffocating. I remember pressing my palms against my ears, thinking maybe I could hear something if I blocked out everything else. But all I heard was the pounding of my own blood like a drum inside my skull. That sound terrified me more than shouting ever could. The kitchen returns too, though differently than before. The microwave clock still reads 9:27, even though I know time had passed. That frozen number haunts me, as though part of me never left that moment. I see myself standing there, hands gripping the counter, staring at the clock as if I could force it to move. The numbers glowed red, steady, unchanging, mocking me. Sometimes I wonder if my mind has trapped me in that instant, circling it forever. Then there are the hands, always the hands. I can't escape the image of them, pale, trembling, disconnected. I recall holding them out in front of me, turning them as if they belonged to someone else. In the dim light, they looked foreign, even hostile. I whispered to them, I don't remember the words, maybe a plea, maybe an accusation. They didn't answer. They only shook, silent as though refusing to acknowledge me. I remember sitting down on the floor in the hallway, leaning my back against the wall. The carpet scratched against my skin, and I pressed my palms flat against it, trying to ground myself, to remind myself of something solid. But even the floor felt unstable, like it might give way beneath me. I pulled my knees to my chest and rocked back and forth. The motion soothed me for a moment, like I was trying to cradle myself, but the relief didn't last. The silence crept back in, heavier than before. Sometimes the fragments bleed together like a film reel, cut and spliced out of order. The hallway flickers into the kitchen flickers into the living room flickers into darkness. I see shapes without faces, hear voices without words. I can't trust what my mind gives me. Was the door open or closed? Was the light steady or flickering? Did I sit on the couch or the floor? None of it holds still long enough to be certain. What I know is this. Something irreversible occurred in that gap. My memory refuses to show me. I feel the weight of it even if I can't see it. It presses down on me every time I breathe. A constant reminder that those missing minutes hold the truth I can't face. And maybe I never will. The fragments keep coming, no matter how much I want them to stop. They arrive in dreams, in sudden flashes during the day, in the moments I least expect. I'll be washing my hands and suddenly I'll see them again, trembling, pale, foreign. I'll be walking down a street and the silence will return, heavy, suffocating, as if the world has been muted. I'll look at a clock, and no matter what numbers it shows, my mind replaces them with 9:27. Always 9:27. And so I live inside these broken pieces, circling them, trying to put them together, even though I know they may never form a whole. The night exists for me as fragments, and I exist within them, haunted, incomplete, always searching for the missing part that refuses to surface. What I have learned about memory is that it doesn't just fail, it also lies. It rearranges, edits, erases, replaces. What I hold in my head now are not clean truths, but distorted pieces like water-stained photographs. Each time I examine them, they look slightly different, sometimes sharper, sometimes more blurred, but never complete. One of the clearest fragments is the living room. I see the lamp standing in the corner, its shade tilted, while the fabric frayed at the edges, The light it cast was yellow, soft, and yet it painted the room in unnatural shadows, stretching across the carpet in shapes I didn't recognize. I remember staring at one of those shadows, convinced it was moving even though nothing else was. My mind insisted it had a life of its own, something crawling just out of reach. Then the hallway returns. The air there felt thicker, harder to breathe, as if someone had turned up the humidity even though it was a dry New Mexico night. I remember dragging my fingers along the wall as I walked, leaving faint streaks behind. Though I don't know if it was sweat or something else. My nails dug into the paint, and I found small flakes beneath my fingertips. I kept pressing harder as if I could peel away the house itself, uncover something hidden beneath. Another fragment is the kitchen sink. I stood over it at some point, I can't recall when, and turned on the faucet. Water rushed out, but the sound was wrong. It roared in my ears, so loud I thought it would split me in two. I let it run, staring at the stream, unable to move. The water looked thicker than it should, like it carried weight, like it was more than water. My reflection in the surface trembled, rippled, warped into a stranger's face. I turned the faucet off, but the sound continued inside my head for a long time after. There is also the fragment of the window. I remember pulling the curtain aside and looking out into the night. The street was empty, the world outside perfectly still, but I felt eyes on me. Not from the houses across the street, not from a passerby. Eyes that came from nowhere, everywhere. My skin prickled and I let the curtain fall back quickly, as if I had caught myself doing something forbidden. At times I remember sitting down. Sometimes it's on the couch, sometimes on the floor, sometimes at the edge of my bed upstairs. Each time I am holding my head in my hands, trying to stop the buzzing inside my skull. The images flicker too fast, like someone spooling through a film reel at double speed. I see flashes. The clock at 9:27, my trembling hands, the shadows stretching on the carpet, the tilted lampshade, the doorknob I didn't turn, over and over the same pieces rearranged. And then there's the sound I can't place. Not quite a thud, not quite a crack. Something in between. I don't know where it fits in the timeline. I don't know what caused it. It echoes in my mind, sudden, sharp, followed by silence. That sound comes back to me in dreams, startling me awake, though I can never identify it. All I know is that after it, nothing felt the same. I also remember smell. It's strange because memory often forgets smell, but not here. The air grew heavy, metallic, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. I gagged, covered my nose, but it didn't go away. The whole house seemed to breathe it, as if the walls themselves exhaled something foul. I tell myself maybe it was my imagination, maybe it was a trick of panic, but deep down I know it wasn't. The mirror in the bathroom is another fragment. I looked at myself, and the face staring back didn't belong to me. My eyes looked too wide, my skin too pale, my lips cracked and trembling. I whispered, "Who are you?" But the reflection didn't answer. For a moment I thought it smirked, but I blinked, and it was only my own mouth trembling. I splashed water on my face, but even that felt foreign, like pouring liquid onto someone else's skin. The stairs blur into my memory as well. I climbed them at one point, each step creaking beneath me. Halfway up I froze. I thought I heard breathing behind me. Slow, deliberate, steady. I turned, but the hallway below was empty. Still I could feel it, a presence, heavy and close. I rushed the rest of the way up, heart pounding, though when I reached the top I couldn't remember why I had gone upstairs in the first place. These fragments don't make a story. They don't explain what happened, and maybe they never will, but they're all I have, all my mind will allow me to hold. A tilted lampshade, a flickering light, a doorknob untouched, a clock frozen at 9:27, trembling hands, silence heavier than sound. These pieces circle me, trap me, taunt me with the missing truth. Sometimes I wonder if remembering would save me or destroy me. Perhaps the mind protects itself for a reason, leaving certain doors locked. But every day, every night, I feel those locked doors pressing against me, threatening to burst open. And if they do, if the full picture returns, I don't know if I will survive it. I understand that what I say now must be recorded in full, and that the details I provide will be compared against the physical evidence already collected from the house. I will give you everything I can remember in order, even if my memory is incomplete in some places. On the evening of September 14th, 2025, I was at home at 1327 Calle del Sol, Albuquerque. It was a Sunday, and the day had been uneventful until later in the evening. Around 8:45 p.m., I recall being in the living room, scrolling through my phone while my mother prepared something in the kitchen. My father was in his study, and my brother came home just before 9. At approximately 9:10 p.m., there was an argument. I cannot state clearly what began it. My memory of the words is fractured, but the tone was hostile and loud. I moved between the living room and the kitchen during this time, unable to stay in one place. The microwave clock, which I remember vividly, read 9:27 p.m. at one point. That number has stayed with me, though I cannot say why. The events between 9:30 and 9:50 p.m. are fragmented. I know that I was moving through the house during this period. I know that I experienced periods of silence, of disorientation, and of what I can only describe as detachment from myself. My memory refuses to supply more. By 10:05 p.m., the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt permanent. I walked slowly through each room. I recall adjusting the curtain in the living room so that the street outside was no longer visible. I also recall washing my hands at the kitchen sink for an extended time, though they did not feel clean afterward. Between 10:15 and 11 p.m., I began to move objects. Not large pieces of furniture, but smaller things. A blanket from the couch, several cushions, items that could cover, conceal, or absorb. I cannot fully explain my thinking, but it was deliberate, and it was done in silence. I remember pulling a rug slightly out of place, realigning it after I was done. At some point after 11:30 p.m., I went upstairs. I gathered items, cleaning supplies, plastic bags, gloves from the hallway closet. I carried them back down carefully, avoiding making noise, though no one was left to hear me. The early morning hours blurred. I know I spent time in the garage. I know I used the back door rather than the front. I know I left certain items outside, in the trash bins, though I cannot list them all now. I recall the sound of the lid closing, the hollow echo that rang louder in my ears than it should have. At 4:12 a.m., I sat in the kitchen again. The clock on the microwave still worked. I remember the new numbers glowing, almost taunting me with the passage of time. I felt both outside of it and trapped within it. I stayed there until the first light of morning came through the blinds. These are the details I can give you. They may not answer everything, but they are true to what I recall. What is missing is not omission by choice, but absence in my mind. I know what the investigators found in the house will fill the gaps I cannot. I understand now that motive is as important to you as the sequence of events. You want to know why. The truth is not complicated. It was not money, not self-defense, not an accident. It was resentment that had been building for years, and on the night of September 14th, 2025, it became unbearable. My family expected me to be someone I could never be. I was the younger one, the quiet one, the one who was supposed to succeed where others had failed. Every day I carried their disappointment. My brother reminded me of it most directly. His words sharper, crueler, always delivered as though they were facts, not insults. My father reinforced it with silence that weighed more than shouting. My mother carried it in her eyes, in the way she looked at me, a mixture of pity and pressure. By that evening, I felt trapped inside their version of me, a version I did not recognize. The argument at 9:10 p.m. was only the spark. The fire had been waiting. I cannot tell you what was said, but I can tell you how it felt. Every word was another weight pressing down, every accusation another wall closing in. The sense that I had no escape became so strong that escape itself transformed into destruction. I did not decide in a clear, logical way. I simply reached the point where silence felt like the only solution. Between 9:30 and 9:50 p.m., my memory is still unreliable. But what followed was not confusion, it was focus. I remember that clearly, a strange, cold clarity that replaced panic. My movements became purposeful. I began to think in terms of order. What must be hidden? What must be cleaned? What must be removed? I did not rush. I moved slowly, deliberately, because the panic was gone. I closed doors, I drew curtains, I adjusted furniture so nothing would appear disturbed. I collected items from the closet, bags, gloves, bottles of cleaning liquid, and carried them one by one. I used blankets and rugs to obscure what needed to be obscured. I opened the garage not because I intended to flee, but because it was another space to use. I remember writing something down on a notepad from the kitchen drawer around 11:40 p.m. It was not a confession, not a note of apology. It was a list, simple bullet points, what to move, what to throw away, what to keep inside. I tore the page out and later destroyed it, but the act of writing helped me impose order on the situation. At some point between midnight and 2 a.m., I placed certain items into trash bags. I tied them tightly and carried them to the bins, outside by the back alley. I cannot provide a complete inventory of those bags, but I know they contained objects that, if found inside, would have raised immediate questions. The sound of the bin lids closing remains sharp in my memory. It felt like a marker of finality. I returned inside and focused on the surfaces, the floor, the counters, the hallway wall where I had pressed my nails earlier. I wiped until I could no longer see marks. I worked methodically, moving room by room, careful not to miss corners. I was not thinking in terms of guilt. I was thinking in terms of completion. By 3:30 a.m., the house looked ordinary again, too ordinary perhaps. The silence was unnatural, but the space itself resembled what it had been hours before. Curtains drawn, lights dimmed, everything in its place. I sat in the kitchen at 4:12 a.m., watching the microwave clock. I remember the number exactly because unlike 9:27, these digits did change. Time had moved forward even if I felt stuck inside it. I sat there until light seeped through the blinds and the reality of morning made the work I had done feel both invisible and permanent. You asked for motive and I have given it. You asked for sequence and I have given it to the extent I can. What remains are the missing minutes, those I cannot recover, no matter how much I try. But everything after them was my own doing. I carried it out calmly, with precision. That is the truth of my statement. There were moments in the days that followed when my mind betrayed me. I would sit in the kitchen staring at the oven and the thought would come uninvited. What if I could make them disappear in a way no one could ever trace? It was not a plan, not even a real intention, but a picture that formed on its own, grotesque and vivid. I imagined turning absence into a recipe, grief into something baked and sealed away, like mixing flour and sugar until it no longer resembled what it once was. The oven light would flick on, its small square window glowing orange, and I would feel a strange pull as if it were offering me a way out. a way to disguise everything. My rational mind knew how absurd, how impossible, how horrifying the thought was. But the thought itself clung to me, replaying like a song I couldn't turn off. I never touched the oven controls, never opened the door, but sometimes I caught myself placing my hands on the counter, palms flat as though preparing for something I couldn't admit. That was when I realized the house itself had begun speaking to me, whispering solutions in the form of madness. I want it to be understood that I did not act out of confusion, nor do I see myself as insane. Every decision I made after that night was calculated, not frantic. I closed the curtains, I moved the objects, I arranged the rooms, not because I panicked, but because I wanted order. For the first time in years, I was the one who created the structure of the house, not the one living under it. You may call it wrong, the law certainly will, but in my mind it was balance. For years I was diminished, criticized, treated as though I was nothing but a mistake waiting to happen. My brother reminded me daily that I would never match him. My parents carried disappointment like it was my inheritance. On September 14th, that ended, I ended it. The thoughts I had afterward, about making everything disappear, about turning absence into something permanent, were not fantasies to me. They were symbols of control. Standing at the oven, staring at its light, I understood that I could transform what had happened into something else, something I ruled over. That was the first time in my life I felt powerful, not powerless. I know investigators will dissect every detail, will assign words like disturbed or delusional to my account, but I need this statement to carry my truth. I believed and still believe that what I did was necessary. It was not random, not without reason. It was the correction of years of suffocation. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not asking for sympathy. I am stating facts. On the night of September 14th, 2025, I took control of my life in a way I had never done before. And even now, sitting here, speaking these words, I hold to one belief above all others. I was right. At night, the silence doesn't stay silent. It fills with voices that don't belong to me, voices that sound like echoes of my family but twisted, overlapping, as though they crawl out of the walls. My brother's laugh, sharp and cruel, repeats in the dark. You'll never be enough, you'll never be enough. My mother's whisper hisses in my ear. What have you done? What have you done? What have you done? Sometimes my father's voice is different. It doesn't accuse, it commands. Fix it, put it back, undo what you did. I tell myself I was right, the way I always told myself. I repeat it like I did in the statement. I was right, I was right, I was right. But the words sound thinner each time and the voices only grow stronger. They interrupt, they mock, they drown me out until I can't tell if I'm speaking or if it's them speaking through me. The house is no longer mine. Every door creaks with memory. Every corner feels like it hides a shadow waiting to step out. When I walk down the hallway, I hear footsteps behind me, but when I turn, there is nothing. When I touch the walls, they feel warm, as if someone pressed their hand there just before me. I know it's impossible, but my body reacts as though they're still here, watching, accusing. The oven is the worst. I can't look at it anymore. The glow that once felt like control now feels like an eye, unblinking, staring at me until my skin crawls. Sometimes I think I hear a voice from inside it, muffled and slow, like words spoken through water. I don't dare open it. I don't dare check. Sleep gives no escape. When I close my eyes, I see fragments, hands reaching, eyes open but still, lips moving without sound. I wake up gasping, my throat raw, convinced I heard them breathing beside me. I check the rooms, the closets, the corners, over and over, but the emptiness only makes the voices louder. It's no longer just memory, it's infestation. They are inside my head, filling every gap. My thoughts are not mine alone. I wonder sometimes if this is punishment, if the balance I created has turned back on me. And still, I try to cling to the one belief that kept me steady. I was right, but now every time I say it, another voice answers back, "No, you weren't." I folded that part of my life into a quiet pocket and tried to keep it there, like a letter shoved into the lining of a coat. For a while the coat held, neighbors whispered, detectives asked their questions, reporters circled like distant birds. And I answered in the same measured tone I had practiced on mornings when I rehearsed what grief should look like. People believed what they saw, an exhausted daughter who had lost everything. The world moved around me with a terrible decency, offering casseroles, asking polite questions, and pretending to understand. I learned how to accept those gestures the way you accept a bandage, without peeking, but the rituals of the living, meals, laundry, phone calls, didn't seal the hollowness. They only revealed it in new ways. At first I could still find shelter in rationalizations. They deserved what they gave me, I would whisper under my breath. I was right. That sentence was like a warm stone I clutched against the cold of what I had done. It gave weight, it gave cause, it kept the edges of my composure from crumbling. Gradually, tiny things began to undo me. The smell of laundry detergent recalled the curve of my mother's hand on the washer's lid. A song on the radio caught the cadence of my brother's laugh. A neighbor's child who looked like my brother's son would cross the street, and for a second my brain would supply the rest. A life that would never come to be. Each ordinary echo carved a space inside me where silence used to be. The silence returned not as peace but as a presence, full and accusing. Night became a ritual of filaments. I would lie awake until the house gave its last breath, and then the voices would arrive. Not the full, clear sentences I had used to justify myself, but fragments, softer, more intimate. You were right, the thought I clung to would murmur, then another would slip in. And you were wrong. They weren't external voices so much as changes in the inner weather, one gust pulling toward absolution, another toward ruin. These winds tangled until I couldn't tell which gust I had sent into being. Sleep offered only thin, theatrical relief, dreams that felt like rehearsals of memory. In those dreams, I watched myself move through the house with the curious detachment of an accomplice in someone else's life. Sometimes I watched the scene from the ceiling, a spectator to my own motions. Sometimes I was the motion, the difference between watching and acting blurred until guilt, which had been an abstract word, lived in my ribs like a physical thing, heavy, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Public suspicion tightened like a band. A face at the grocery store that lingered too long, a comment from someone who thought they were being kind but sounded like accusation. Colleagues who once offered small talk now asked about court dates in hushed voices. Requests for interviews and recordings arrived with increasing frequency. The camera, lights, and microphones felt like flares that etched me into a shape I could no longer inhabit. I replied with practice lines, and each time I did, the belief I had once had that I was right eroded a little more under the weight of other people's eyes. I began to misplace things on purpose and then panic at the thought that they might be found. A scrap of paper with a list, a glove, a blanket, objects that had been meaningful in ways I refused to name. When those objects were not found by others, I would feel a brief, vicious relief, followed instantly by a shame that tasted metallic in my mouth. The relief was always the liar. Shame was the honest currency. The liar and the honest thing battled inside me, and shame was winning because it never slept. The rational arguments that had sustained me, they crushed me. I had to respond. became brittle under loneliness. There is a peculiar cruelty in being both visible and unseen. People spoke about the tragedy, but they did not see the part of me that had been necessary to the act, nor did they understand the part that now wanted only to be forgiven. I tried confession in small forms, admissions into a thick journal, sentences scribbled and burned, a single line written and then crossed out until the page was a blackened haze. Writing was both relief and torment. The act of naming made the deed more real, while the destruction of the page felt like a futile attempt at erasure. Sometimes I thought of turning myself in. The idea arrived like a sound in a dream, soft, clear, then gone. But when the thought stuck, it came wrapped in terror. Terror of the courtroom, of the faces I would have to meet, of the way the law would strip me down to evidence and nothing else. I imagined myself in a room where every nuance, every rationalization would be examined and found wanting. The image terrified me and perversely kept me from acting. Better to live with the gnawing and the daily performances than to test whether the world could ever accept what I had done. Instead, guilt found other ways to press at me. It came as physical symptoms: sudden nausea at the sight of a dinner table, dizziness when I passed an intersection I associated with a childhood memory, phantom touches on my shoulder when I was alone. My hands, once tools of deliberate work, began to betray tremors that had nothing to do with sleep or stress tests. I would press my palms to the table as if to slow whatever pulse the room carried, and for a moment I would feel both the memory and the impression it left behind. The voices changed too. They grew less like echoes of other people and more like my own inner chorus, multiplying and contradicting. One part of me still argued for the rightness of the act, citing years of pressure and the sense of being erased. Another part, the part that woke before dawn and stared at the ceiling, whispered about faces and small daily kindnesses I had destroyed. The two parts did not agree. They fought. In their fighting, they showed me the shape of a life I had ended and a life I no longer trusted in myself. And then, in a morning that began like any other, I caught myself arranging a plate on the kitchen counter with fingers that remembered a different kind of touch, gentle, precise, domestic, and for a split second the absurdity of what I had imagined before washed back over me. The grotesque picture I had once conjured in a moment of cold control, a fantasy of turning absence into something digestible. The image that once felt like control now recoiled at the light of day. I felt nausea at its memory, and with the nausea came a tiny, undeniable fissure in the fortress of my self-justification. That fissure widened quickly. The mantra, I was right, began to thin each time I mouthed it. Sometimes it snapped entirely and left silence. Silence was worse because it allowed the other sounds to fill it. Sobs I couldn't stop, a memory of my mother's fingers knitting in the afternoon light, the way my brother used to whistle a song while fixing a bike. Those small, mundane images turned into accusations because they represented all the ordinary futures I had taken away. I found myself talking to no one and everyone, confessing in the public anonymity of an online forum under a name no one knew. I left messages on an old answering machine I didn't intend anyone to check. I rehearsed apologies that would never be spoken aloud. The compulsion to unburden battled with the fear of consequence until the two forces made me a person split in halves. One half that remembered the logic of suffocation and the other half that slowly remembered, with painful clarity, the faces I had silenced. By the time I realized how far the rupture had gone, the coat of composure had patches and holes. The house felt too small for the thing I carried. The logic that had once felt like a stone of proof now seemed like ballast that kept me from floating but did not stop my sinking. The guilt was not a single moment but a tide. slow and relentless, and I knew with an awful certainty that the tide would not recede simply because I willed it so. I kept living then in the liminal space between the act and its consequences, where every ordinary thing became a summons, every silence a tribunal. The voices did not stop. They multiplied, argued, and finally, with a corrosion all the more intimate for being interior, they began to win. I wake up every morning with the same weight pressing against my chest, heavier than the blankets I pull over myself. It is not the kind of heaviness that can be lifted by a deep breath or a cup of coffee. It sits inside me, patient and constant, like a stone placed exactly where my lungs should be. No one else can see it. To everyone else, I am just another woman walking through the motions of life. To me, every step feels stolen, every smile rehearsed, every conversation a lie stretched thin across a wound that refuses to close. Sometimes guilt takes the shape of silence, so loud that it rings in my ears until I want to scream just to hear another sound. Other times it becomes a chorus of voices, not from outside but from within, fragments of memory and invention tangled together. My mother calling my name in the kitchen, my brother laughing behind his closed bedroom door, whispers that twist into questions. Why? What have you done? The voices never wait for an answer, because they know there is none that can satisfy. I carry the guilt into every room I enter. At the grocery store, I see my reflection in the glass doors and wonder if the cashier notices the way my hands shake when I pay. At night, I hear footsteps that aren't there, doors opening and closing in the house when I am the only one inside. My body betrays me. I drop plates, spill water, forget simple tasks. It is as though guilt is not only in my mind, but in my muscles, rewriting the way I move through the world. There are moments when I almost convince myself that I can endure it, that if I stay quiet long enough, the weight will fade. But guilt doesn't fade. It grows, curling around me like smoke, filling every corner of my existence. I feel it when I laugh too easily at a stranger's joke, when I sit too still on the bus, when I catch myself imagining a life that might have been. It doesn't matter where I am or what I do. The guilt follows, a shadow that refuses to separate from my body. The cruelest part is that it doesn't only punish me for what I did, it punishes me for what could have been, for every memory that might have existed if I had chosen differently. I picture birthdays never celebrated, meals never shared, conversations that will never happen. I imagine futures I destroyed before they had the chance to arrive, and each image is sharper than any blade, cutting me again and again with reminders of the lives I took away. At night, I try to silence the voices with rituals, counting, pacing, pressing my forehead against the wall until I feel the ache spread. None of it works. The voices only laugh, only remind me that I am the architect of my own prison. Even when I sleep, guilt finds me. I dream of locked doors, of endless corridors, of hands reaching out but never touching. I wake up gasping, as though drowning in air. I wonder sometimes if confession would end it, if speaking the truth out loud would let the stone inside me shatter. But the thought of facing the world, of seeing their eyes harden with disgust, is unbearable, so I keep the truth caged inside, even though the cage tears at me. I am both the prisoner and the warden, and neither role grants me peace, and so I live this way. Each day a rehearsal for normalcy, each night a trial I fail. Guilt is not a passing storm. It is a season without end, a permanent climate that seeps into my blood. No matter where I go, it is with me, whispering, reminding, condemning. I wake into a world that keeps sliding sideways. The stone in my chest has grown into something that moves. It shifts when I tilt my head, it presses harder when I stand up. It thickens when the light changes. The borders between what is mine and what is not have dissolved. Faces in crowds smear into one another. Voices braid together until I cannot tell which belongs to my mother and which to a stranger. The house, my house, no longer feels like shelter. It is a theatre and also a trap. Sometimes it breathes around me. At first the intrusions were small, a name whispered under breath, a laugh that arrived an instant after my thought. Then they multiplied. They arrive layered, overlapping like radio stations out of tune. One voice will say, "You were right," and another will cut in, "You were wrong." Sometimes 1,000 tiny voices argue at once, a static that I try to pass like language until my head splits. The more I try to pin them down, the faster they change. I have learned to stop asking who they are and start listening to what they want from me, which is never mercy. Sleep has become a rumor. Nights are filled with motion, my own limbs moving before I awaken. The sense of pacing I cannot remember. The occasional thud or clatter that wakes me with my heart lodged against my ribs. I go to bed exhausted and wake feeling as if the day has already lived through me. When I close my eyes, the house rearranges itself behind my lids. Doors open where there were none, rooms lengthen into halls I never saw before. I will stand at the foot of my bed and not recognize the hallway leading away from it. Sometimes I follow it anyway. The world outside tightens like a fist. I misread expressions. Colleagues' small remarks land like deliberate accusations. Once, a friend asked about the weather, and I saw the white of their teeth and heard my brother's laugh, sharp, triumphant, and I walked away as if I had been struck. Grocery aisles feel like corridors of witnesses. Canned goods stand in rows like quiet judges. I start to avoid sunlight because light maps too clearly the contours of things I would rather not see. The way a hand rests on a shoulder, the way a cup sits empty. Light forces reality to be precise, and I have grown accustomed to things blurring. My hands betray me more and more. They fumble with small tasks until I drop them. Keys, dishes, a phone that spins and cracks on the pavement. Sometimes I wake with bruises I cannot explain, with scraped knuckles from a corner I don't remember hitting. Other times I find I have done things methodically in a fog, cleaned a surface until the cloth was thin and useless, moved a chair for reasons I could not articulate, only to stand back later and not understand why I had done it. The doing and the remembering are on different tracks now. Paranoia arrives like an intimacy. I suspect cameras in placeless corners, people who glance and know. I sense patterns in casual remarks. A neighbor's question about my late parents becomes a coded confession. A clerk's bored expression reads as disdain. I rehearse explanations for things that have not yet happened, as if that will make them less likely. I pace at night thinking of entrances, exits, sequences of events I might face. My mind builds scenarios like a nervous architect, each structure more elaborate and less connected to what actually is. The voices have grown bolder. They are no longer just echoes of those I loved or resented. They have voices I do not recognize, intonations that belong to strangers, children, old men on the bus. One will whisper suggestions, small, stupid choices to see how I will react. Another will chant the same phrase until it becomes a mood rather than a sentence. You finished it, you finished it, you finished it. The repetition erodes the edges of shame and pride until they become the same vague sensation of being watched from inside my skin. Once standing at the kitchen sink, I heard them decide my fate for me. Now we will make it right. The phrase was not an instruction so much as a certainty. In those moments I feel a terrible calm, a glacier moving. The calm does not persuade me so much as it takes me like an exhausted animal surrendering to a river. I move through the acts it suggests, folding, placing, closing, without the small protests I used to have. Afterwards, I will wake with my hands cold and my mouth tasting of metal, and the voices will applaud, softly, pleased with the compliance. Reality retaliates in inconvenient ways. Phones ring with numbers I don't recognize. Mail arrives with forms that mention dates and hearings I had not expected. Once a detective called and I had to explain why I had been at a place at a time that didn't align with the timeline I had practiced. He asked direct questions. I answered in fragments, in partial truths. My answers carried the hollow ring of performance, and the detective's patience showed as a face that cooled. After the call, the house felt smaller by degrees. I have moments where the veil lifts for a second, and I see clearly the line I crossed. These flashes are tiny and bright as a match, and they burn. I remember my mother's hands more precisely than in months. The pattern of the veins, the small scar along her thumb from an old accident. I recall my brother's laugh not as something cruel, but as a sound that used to make me stop and wait. The clarity is unbearable because it is precise and unforgiving. It changes me from someone who did a necessary thing to someone who destroyed threads of being without ceremony. At other times, my sense of self fractures entirely. I will look in the mirror and watch a dozen faces settle into my reflection like lenses overlapping. I speak and I hear another voice answering before I finish. I touch my arm and feel a stranger's skin. There is terror here, yes, but also fatigue, so absolute it feels like a new kind of numbness. Numbness allows movement without feeling, and movement as how I pass the day. People begin to talk about me differently. Sympathies that once came easily now arrive weighed and tentative. Friends stop calling as often, the frequency of messages thinning until the inbox sits like an accusation. The small comforts that used to exist, coffee with someone on a grey morning and neighbours' borrowed sugar, become treacherous. Each ordinary kindness stretches into a test. Will they probe? Will they look too long? Will they ask me to explain what I can no longer explain? The guilty parts of me keep trying to bargain. I write things I never send. I organize lists of things to do, rituals that promise the slightest absolution. Task completed will balance the ledger. I wake up at strange hours and clean until the house gleams, as if cleanliness could erase consequence. Once I left a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I am sorry." I folded it neatly and then left it where no one would find it. The note was a confession and a lie. It was my smallest possible admission and my largest possible concealment. My grasp on cause and effect loosens. Days collapse into each other. A week can pass and feel like the flicker between two heartbeats. I forget where I put things. I forget names. I forget that I have eaten. The people around me grow blurry. Their faces are sketches that the mind can fill with whatever it wishes. I become a caricature of myself, present enough to be recognized but absent enough to be suspected. Most nights the voices vote and the verdict is always something like "not yet." They delay me with fantasies, with rehearsals for betrayals, with scenarios that play the same few acts over and over. The delay is its own punishment. It is the slow digestion of the life I took away. Each day of waiting is a small consumption of the self. Loss of control feels like drowning at low tide. There is no dramatic crash, only an ongoing suffocation. I find myself screaming into pillows, rocking until I no longer know my center, pressing my palms flat against walls as if to stop the world from spinning. I talk aloud sometimes to make sure my voice is still mine. Sometimes the words I say surprise me. I do not recognize their shape. "Forgive me," I will whisper, and the house will answer with the echo of my own breath. There is a moment near dawn when the world loosens its grip for a beat, and I imagine, briefly, that I can be different. I imagine confessing in a way that is honest and entire, seeing the faces of those I harmed and offering them the apology that would be enough. The fantasy is as sharp as pain. In it, the voice is quiet. My hands stop shaking, the stone in my chest cracks. But morning arrives with the same small betrayals. A siren passing in the distance, a neighbor's dog barking, an email notification. The fantasy dissolves like fog. The voices swell again, claiming the day, and with them my certainty erodes until there is nothing left but the shapes they leave behind. They gave me life without the chance of parole. The words fell like a hammer, heavy and final, and yet not as sharp as I had imagined. I had braced myself for the blow, but the sound of it still echoed through me like a bell tolling in an empty room. There would be no decades to count down, no hope of a date circled on a calendar, just an endless horizon of days inside walls that look the same no matter how you turn your head. Some said the sentence was merciful, others whispered it was too light. I did not argue. For me, there is no number that can measure the weight of what I took. 10 years, 50 years, 100. It would all dissolve into the same endless replay of memory. The real prison was never these walls. It was always inside me, in the voices that will not stop, in the guilt that does not fade, in the faces I will never see again except when I close my eyes. Now I wake each morning in a narrow bed, count the bars in the small square of window, and remind myself, this is the consequence I chose when I confessed. The world knows me as a monster. The law knows me as a criminal. And I know myself as both. There is no escaping it. This is the sentence, and it will last as long as I draw breath. They read my sentence aloud in a courtroom that smelled of dust and iron, life without parole. The words landed heavier than the chains around my wrists. I had expected years, numbers I could count, something finite to hold in my hands. Instead, they gave me eternity in a cage, a life stretched out with no ending but death. I did not protest. I did not cry. I simply stood there while the world decided what to do with me. Some people in the room nodded, satisfied that justice had spoken. Others looked at me with disgust, as if my presence was a stain that could never be scrubbed clean. I accepted their eyes the way I accepted the sentence. There was nothing left to defend. Now I wake each morning behind bars, the sound of doors slamming shut louder than any voice in my head. My body belongs to the prison, but my mind still carries the weight of what I did. Heavier than any concrete wall. This is the end of my story. Not freedom, not forgiveness, only punishment, both from the law and from myself.